Hello, everyone, and welcome to Can You Hear Me? I'm Eileen Rochford, CEO of the Harbinger Group, a marketing and strategy firm.
And I'm Rob Johnson, president of Rob Johnson Communications. For those of you who listen regularly, you know that we like to tackle topics that are top of mind for leaders in the C-suite. And today's discussion, is DEI still a priority? Certainly fits that mold.
That's right, Rob. So first, let's start with just a little bit of context. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, commonly referred to as DEI, really emerged at the forefront of business in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. And suddenly, businesses, government entities, and organizations everywhere were asked really tough questions about whether enough was being done to provide a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. So many started DEI committees and began doing really challenging work of asking hard questions about what kind of workplace did they have.
That's right. And not only is it seen as the right thing to do, but in many cases, if you were competing for corporate or government clients, one of the first questions asked was whether you had a DEI policy. If you couldn't articulate your company's vision, you might miss out on opportunities. 4 years later, though, we're wondering whether DEI is still a priority.
That's right. It seems that the tide is shifting, things are changing. So we really want to talk about that today. Recently, I think this was just about 2 months ago in March of 2024, an article in Crain's Chicago Business that was titled "The DEI Backlash Has Come for Chicago C-Suites" stated that, quote, "Programs created to ensure fair treatment and broader representation are under attack across the U.S. In fact, Kimberly Dowdell, the president of the 167-year-old American Institute of Architects, the largest design organization in the world, which boasts nearly 100,000 members, was quoted in that article saying, "It's really disturbing how quickly the pendulum is shifting back toward a less inclusive and diverse society."
So when we read that article, we knew we needed to discuss this critical DEI issue again and invite Kimberly Dowdell on Can You Hear Me to do so. So we'd like to give a warm welcome to Kimberly Dowdell, the first president of the AIA, who is a Black millennial. And Kim, thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you on. We appreciate you joining us.
Hello. Thank you for having me. This is going to be a good discussion.
I think it's going to be. So, Kim, why don't you start off by giving us your background, your origin story, and how you got here?
Sure. So I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, which is actually where I'm sitting today. And my origin story is really rooted in seeing Detroit in the 80s and 90s as a youngster, and a lot of the disinvestment that was sort of characteristic of the city at that time. 4 decades later, I'm really pleased that Detroit is coming back. But at the time, some really beautiful old buildings that were built 100 years ago, were starting to come out of service. They were being boarded up and demolished and all of these things. So as a little kid, that really impacted me, just seeing things that, I was sort of used to seeing start to come down and sort of things start to deteriorate. And so as a little kid, I wanted to be a doctor because I wanted to help people. And then I had this epiphany moment after I had learned about architecture in a middle school art class. I said, looking at this one particular building, the Hudson's department store in downtown Detroit, I said, I want to be an architect so that I can fix this building so that we can help to heal the community. So that was kind of the origin story of wanting to become an architect, being like a healer for the larger, neighborhood context, in this particular case, downtown, which I think has an impact on the neighborhood. So that was really how it got started for me as an 11-year-old. And then I went off to architecture school and I did what I like to call a 14-year East Coast tour. So I've lived in 7 cities at this point, most of them on the East Coast, but Detroit is where I started. And then I moved to Chicago in 2019 when I rejoined HOK, which is the firm where I work, a global design firm. So that's kind of a short overview of kind of where I've been and how this all started. But I became AIA president actually 22 weeks ago. And I know that because I do a weekly social media post on what I've been up to as AIA president. So this is week 22, and I did my post earlier today. And a big part of why I ran for AIA president is because there had never been a Black woman in that position. As was mentioned, it was founded 167 years ago, and we just hadn't gotten there. And I had a pretty successful term as president of NOMA, which is the National Organization of Minority Architects, in 2019 and 2020, nearly tripling our membership, more than doubling the NOMA membership, raising over $1 million, establishing a staff for the first time. So I felt pretty good about, sort of scaling up, if you will, and running for AI president, which I did in 2022. So that's where we are today.
Congratulations. That's fantastic. Good for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Absolutely. I'm just really proud that you had the desire to do that. That's really fantastic. Like it's really, sometimes women in particular, we don't always step forward and say we want something. And I just applaud you for doing that. That's amazing.
Well, thank you. Well, actually, if I could just add a little bit more on that, I would say I wouldn't define it as desire. It was probably more so courage. And that was in part because I said no the first couple of times I was approached about it. So this wasn't like an idea that I had originally. It was like other people were like, you should do this. And I said no, like a couple of times. And then I decided, if not me, who? And if not now, when? So that's how this came about.
So the ask had happened enough times where you really had to kind of assess, maybe this is the right time. Maybe I am the right person. So it was maybe a little bit more reluctance to do it, but it took as you said, the courage to do it. So it was more like looking around the room and going, maybe I am the person. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. So that's how we got here.
That's great. And good for all those people for continuing to encourage you. So very, very happy to hear that. And just a side note, I love your story that you learned about architecture in art class.
Yes.
The importance of art class right there.
100%. In fact, I am currently the board chair of an organization in Chicago called Ingenuity, which works to ensure that all Chicago public school students have access to high quality arts education, because I know firsthand how important that is. So just a quick plug for Ingenuity Chicago.
Very good. I'm glad you mentioned that. Wonderful. Okay. So Kim, as the president of the AIA, you can set forth goals as well as best practices and lots of other things. So what are some of the goals of the AIA and what is your platform for 2024? What are you working to accomplish?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things that I learned when I was president of NOMA is how important it is to have a clear message and set of goals. And so I did all that a few years ago, and I thought to myself, what do I want to put forward for this presidency? And I have a tendency to prefer alliteration and rhyming because it helps people remember things. And so I'll tell you the NOMA thing just so it like puts it in context. So when I was NOMA president, the call to action was for everyone